at the sixth floor museum at Dealey Plaza, and we're pleased to participate in this project and connect with you today. I'm coming to you from the ground floor of the Texas School Book Depository here at the site of the assassination of President Kennedy. In fact, I'm going to show you the view right out the window here so you can see Dealey Plaza live today. It was a little bit of a cold, rainy day earlier. The rain has gone away, but what you're looking at right there is the corner of Houston and Elm Street. And so 56 years ago, on November 22nd, 1963, the presidential motorcade came up this way, came up Houston, made a sharp left turn where you see that truck going right there down Elm Street. And it was just down Elm Street that shots were fired at the president's motorcade, killing President Kennedy and wounding Texas Governor John Connally. Our museum opened here at the site in 1989, and today we look at the life, death, and legacy of President Kennedy in the context of 1960s history and culture. And we're really going to be talking about 1960s history and culture today with this program, JFK and the First Modern Presidential Campaign. We figured since this was an election year, 2020, a historic election coming up, that this would be a terrific opportunity to look back exactly 60 years in the past to the 1960 presidential campaign when these two men were running for president. 1960 was a big year with the recent additions of Hawaii and Alaska. This would be the first presidential election in which all 50 United States would participate. The two-term presidency of Dwight Eisenhower was coming to an end, and the 1950s were symbolically giving way to something new and decidedly different. One of these men would win the presidency in what became one of the closest elections in American history. So on the left, we have the Republican candidate for president, Vice President Richard Nixon. He had been vice president at this point for 8 years under President Dwight Eisenhower. And the man on the right is the Democratic candidate, a Massachusetts senator named John F. Kennedy. Let me start off the program today by asking you guys a question. Which of these men looks older to you? These are portraits done by famous American artist Norman Rockwell. That ran in the Saturday Evening Post. Which of these men look older in these portraits?
South Creek, go ahead.
The guy on the left.
The guy on the left. Yeah, let's just see a show of hands from all the folks we're connecting with. How many of you think the guy on the left, Richard Nixon, looks older? Yeah. He does look older, and you guys are right. He is older. Here are the ages at the bottom of the screen there. So Vice President Nixon in 1960 was 47, and Senator Kennedy was 43. So there really wasn't that much of a difference between them. They were both under the age of 50, and Nixon, of course, 4 years older than Kennedy, but that was lost on many voters because he just simply looked and seemed older. Image was very important. It was then in 1960. It remained so here in 2020. Nixon's image was that of an older, more traditional statesman, and it was an image that was due in large part to his role as vice president for the past 8 years under this man, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was a beloved World War II general who was elected president in 1952, and then he won re-election in 1956. When we look back and think about the 1950s, typically this is the man that comes to mind. This was the age of Eisenhower, the Eisenhower era, and Richard Nixon was his vice president. But he was also the oldest president in American history up to that time. In 1960, President Eisenhower was 70 years old. And look when he was born. He was born in 1890. So in that 1960 campaign, whether it ended up being John F. Kennedy or Richard Nixon, America would have its very first president born in the 1900s. Think about that for a moment. This was the first time we would have a president born in the 20th century. And that was a pretty big deal. Kennedy certainly seized on that idea of change, more so than Richard Nixon did. And so today we're going to look at some campaign material, some TV commercials, and we're going to consider how important image, in other words, how important voter perception was in this first modern election. And we're going to especially look at that crucial role that television played, really for the first time, bringing candidates directly into our living rooms. Here are two posters, campaign posters. On the left, we see Richard Nixon for president with the slogan, "Experienced Leader." And on the right, we have Kennedy for president with the slogan, "A Time for Greatness." So here's another question for you. Looking at these two posters, especially these slogans, what do they tell you about these candidates? If you're a voter in 1960, what do you make of these two men based on these posters?
It looks like Alfred Elementary has an answer. Alfred Elementary, you want to go ahead and try to answer?
I guess. It looks like Kennedy had like one with like a time for greatness. So he's good. So he's trying to make America great.
Very good. Very good. He's also kind of looking off to the side as if he's sort of looking ahead to the future, right? Richard Nixon's making direct eye contact. Nixon, with that slogan, "Experienced Leader," he's really trying to emphasize the experience that he had as vice president for 8 years. John F. Kennedy did not have that experience. He had not been vice president. So that was something Nixon had over Kennedy, and that was important, and it's conveyed there in this poster. Kennedy, "A Time for Greatness" is really one of those phrases, kind of like you just mentioned, making America great. It's one of those phrases that can mean whatever you want it to mean. A time for greatness might mean this is the turn of a new decade. The 1950s are becoming the 1960s. It's an opportunity to look ahead. It's an opportunity for America to be great. Kennedy's very forward thinking. It's a very futuristic message in a lot of ways. This is the time, a time for greatness. So it's interesting that just these little slogans tell us so much about these two men. So let's take a look at a short video now, and it's going to show these guys in action on the campaign trail. And again, think about the message. This is from a newsreel, and there's a narrator telling you what's going on. Think about the messages that Kennedy and Nixon are trying to share with the American people.
Give me your help. Give me your hands and your voice to move America forward. With these words, Senator Kennedy asks the people to support his candidacy and his program. In 14 weeks of campaigning, he attracts enormous crowds. Each of the two candidates travels more than 60,000 miles. They go to small towns and big cities. At railroad stations, airports, and public squares, they meet the people of America. With Vice President Nixon is his wife, Pat. He introduces her to the people, and then he speaks of his program. He speaks of the progress of these past 8 years and the need for keeping experienced leaders at the helm of the nation.
All right. So again, those messages really emphasize there. So we have experienced leadership, the accomplishments of the past 8 years. Nixon as vice president really talking about everything that's come before and how we need to keep that experience at the helm. Kennedy, join me in looking towards the future. Also, just look at the way they were traveling. Nixon traveling by train, a very traditional way for presidential candidates to tour the country. Kennedy is in a convertible automobile going through a dense urban environment, just surrounded by throngs of screaming people, screaming supporters, almost like he's a movie star or a musician. So very different styles in approaching the people. And we also have to think about the time period in which this all took place. Let me tell you a little bit about America in 1960. We were in the middle of an economic recession, and so families were very concerned about their money and also concerned about the rising national debt. We were at the height of an ongoing Cold War with the Soviet Union, with the very real threat of nuclear war. Very real at this time. Young people just like you would have these drills in school where an alarm would go off and we would duck under the desks and put our hands over our heads as if that would save us in case of a nuclear war with Russia. But this was something that a lot of young people were very frightened of, having done these duck and cover drills in school. It was something to be very concerned about. So we wanted a leader who could face up to the Soviet Union and keep America safe. And so foreign policy was very important, especially since Russia had actually just launched the first artificial Earth satellite in space, Sputnik, in 1957. And the civil rights movement was gaining momentum through the South with sit-ins and protests. It really did seem in 1960 like we were not just at the start of a new decade, but we were at the beginning of something very different from the 1950s. And so the question really, in voters' minds, what you guys as voters needed to decide in 1960 was, do you want to stick with the same experienced leadership that you had in the 1950s, or do you want to take a chance with someone younger and a bolder vision of the future? Okay, so let me jump ahead here. Let's look at some of these campaign items from Vice President Nixon. He's really, again, really emphasizing his experience and leadership. That little button on the bottom there, experience counts. It was what was called a flicker pen. You could flick it back and forth and it would show a picture of Nixon on one side, and when you would flip it, it would show a picture of his running mate, Henry Cabot Lodge. But the message there, again, experience counts. His 8 years as vice president under a very popular president was going to give him a big edge, or so he imagined. But let's look especially at that postcard, that political postcard there at the top. We see Nixon kind of very aggressively poking his finger at Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of Russia at that time, the leader of communist Russia. Nixon had engaged Khrushchev in a televised debate in Moscow in 1958, which really made him a Cold War hero in the eyes of many. So this postcard clearly says that Nixon is the only man who can deal with the threat of communism and Russia. And that experience was important because at this time there was this belief that the Soviet Union had gained a strategic advantage over the United States in the number of nuclear missiles. And so when you look at this picture, I mean, you couldn't ask for a more perfect picture for a presidential candidate to have. Nixon is very aggressively, he's poking Nikita Khrushchev. He's got his hand on his jacket there. And let me make sure you guys can still see you can still see the picture, right? On the screen?
Yep.
Okay, very good. So he's poking Nikita Khrushchev on his coat lapel, and look, Khrushchev is blinking. So when you want to have if you're talking about a nuclear standoff between these two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, what better picture can you have where your mortal enemy is literally blinking his eyes? He's blinking first. And so Nixon comes across very aggressive in this photograph, and he is really standing up to our Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union. So that's a very powerful picture for the Nixon campaign to use. But Nixon went about his 1960 campaign with a very traditional campaign approach. Just like in 2020, there were red-leaning states, Republican states, blue-leaning Democratic states, but the map was not quite as defined as it is today. Today, there are only a handful of toss-up states that really can swing the election one way or another. It was a little more fluid in 1960, although there were definitely places where you could count on Democratic support or Republican support in large numbers, which made it all the stranger when Richard Nixon announced that he was going to tour all 50 states of the United States. He was going to travel to and campaign in all 50 states. And that really did not make a lot of sense. It was kind of a strange strategy because, of course, Nixon would have no way at all of winning John F. Kennedy's home state, for example, of Massachusetts. Massachusetts was a fiercely Democratic state. Kennedy was the native son of Massachusetts, but Nixon spent time and money traveling to Massachusetts because it was one of the 50 states. And he was really seizing upon this idea that we are now 50. We have Alaska, we have Hawaii. He's going to travel to all of these. And in many instances, he traveled by train, which was, again, a very old-fashioned approach to campaigning. This movement from state to state, this rigorous travel schedule that Nixon had was pretty hazardous to his health. He injured his knee twice, and his knee became infected at one point, and so he had to recover in a hospital. He was off the campaign trail for a while. He caught pneumonia during the 1960 campaign. And so even though he was keeping up this rigorous travel schedule, all of this campaigning was making him very ill. And it's ironic because Richard Nixon, throughout his entire life, had always been seen as this very healthy and robust individual. Whereas John F. Kennedy, by comparison, he had been sickly most of his life. He had been a sick child and he had a lot of health problems. And yet during that campaign, he was the one that came across as very strong and vigorous. So let's compare that Richard Nixon campaign memorabilia we just looked at with the Kennedy campaign materials that are on the screen right now. So we have two buttons. One of them says "Progress for All." That's a very inclusive message, and it's one that can speak to all Americans. You can take that as meaning economic progress, progress with civil rights. It speaks to everyone. And again, he's got that forward-thinking message, forward, the future, always thinking ahead to the future, moving ahead to something new and different than the 1950s, forward with Kennedy. And that other button really speaks to how Kennedy tapped into the nation's youth. He had broad appeal across the nation's youth. And so that button, if I were 21, which was the voting age in 1960, if I were 21, I'd vote for Kennedy. It's really interesting. That was one of the most popular buttons of the 1960 campaign, and it was worn by young people who weren't yet old enough to even vote. And so you might well ask, why would their support matter when they weren't even eligible to vote? Well, what they did was they created crowds, excitement, they electrified the base, and they elevated Kennedy, as I mentioned a few moments ago, to this status that was usually reserved for a Hollywood celebrity or a rock star, which was the first time. Kennedy was the first politician that we had really seen through that prism, looking at it through the lens of popular celebrity. Kennedy was the first politician to really achieve that. And so these young campaign volunteers, they had a tremendous impact on voters across the country who, seeing these huge crowds, they decided to take a look at this young senator from Massachusetts. And with his good looks and his soaring and inspirational rhetoric, it was very easy, particularly for young people, to get swept up in that Kennedy mystique. So now let's take a look at how these two candidates expressed themselves through the new and very powerful medium of television. There had been campaign commercials on TV since the early 1950s, but they had become much more significant by the 1960 election. In 1960, there were more than 45 million television sets in American homes. Compare that to back in 1952 when Richard Nixon first ran as vice president. Back then, there were only 15 million. So what we had seen is that in 8 years' time, the number of TV sets in American homes had tripled. It was having an extreme modern impact, this technological revolution with television, and politics was needing to embrace this medium to achieve its own goals. So we're going to look at a couple of campaign commercials. First, we're going to see Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate. We're going to take a look at a commercial that aired many times across the country during 1960. And so think of yourself as a 1960 voter and whether or not you would be moved by this message from Vice President Nixon.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon.
I want to talk to you for a moment about civil rights, equal rights for all our citizens. Why must we vigorously defend them? First, because it is right and just. And second, because we cannot compete successfully with communism if we fail to utilize completely the minds and energies of all of our citizens. And third, the whole world is watching us. When we fail to grant equality to all, that makes news, bad news for America all over the world. Now, the record shows there's been more progress in civil rights in the past 8 years than in the preceding 80 years. Because this administration has insisted on making progress. And I want to continue and speed up that progress. I want to help build a better America for all Americans.
Okay, so from Richard Nixon, we had a very traditional campaign commercial. He's literally just sitting there on the edge of the desk, looking directly into the camera. I want to talk to you for a moment about this. And he did several of these, always the same, always sitting there perched on the side of that desk, looking directly into the camera. And he would always start off by saying, I want to talk to you for a moment about the economy. I want to talk to you for a moment about civil rights. So his commercials, while they did address specific issues and got his message across, they did so in a very repetitive way that people would pretty easily get tired of. They were also a little boring. This was one man looking into a camera just talking for a full minute. And that was a lot, even in 1960, for voters to consider. Let's compare that now to John F. Kennedy's primary campaign commercial in 1960.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but that's a doggone season that he won't try something new? A man who's old enough to know
and young enough to do.
Well, it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you.
Do you like a man who answers straight, a man who's always fair?
We'll measure him against the others, and when you compare, you cast your vote for Kennedy and the change that's overdue. So it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. Yes, the Kennedy, 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 Kennedy party. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
Okay. So which of those commercials did you like better? How many of you liked the Kennedy commercial better? Yeah, it's it's pretty universal. I'll admit I did too. It's a pretty catchy song. There's a lot going on in that Kennedy ad, and it would probably linger in people's minds a lot longer than just Richard Nixon talking directly into the camera. What Kennedy managed to squeeze into that remarkable 60-second commercial were lots of photos featuring a diverse array of Americans of all ages and all colors and all backgrounds. And just the overall feeling that things are moving, Kennedy is active, the nation is on the go. If you want to think about this in terms of advertising, if any of you out there have ever seen the TV show Mad Men, which was about advertising in the 1960s, Kennedy here is being packaged like a commodity. He is being sold as a product for voters to buy with a little jingle and everything. Nixon, again, just a talking head who can easily be seen as kind of insecure or even a little preachy in his message. Campaign commercials were not the only way that the candidates dominated the airwaves in 1960. This was also the very first time that we had general election presidential debates. You see here a picture from the very first Kennedy-Nixon debate, September 26, 1960. There was a total of 4 live debates between the two candidates. Now, if you think about today, presidential debates, live debates, that is a traditional part of our campaign cycle. Every 4 years, we can always anticipate presidential debates between the candidates. Now they start early on, and there's multiple debates in the primaries, the vice president's debate, and the presidents usually debate at least three times. But this all started, that tradition really began with John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon in 1960. And everyone really remembers that first debate more than any other. Kennedy paid close attention to where the cameras were going to be positioned that night. He paid attention to the lighting. He arrived early and took a very thorough tour of the set. He even wore makeup before appearing on camera that night. In other words, he was totally prepared to be on television. Nixon, on the other hand, was prepared to discuss the issues, but he was extremely uncomfortable on television. He didn't wear makeup. Instead, his staff ran out and got this stuff that was called lazy shave, which was this like paste that you would put on your face to try and cover up his dark beard stubble. But all it did under those hot studio lights was just make him look very, very pale and ill. And he sweated profusely for the entire debate. And so Nixon came across as ill at ease, whereas Kennedy was in charge, in command, and he looked great on television. There's this old story that says that people who were listening to that debate on the radio thought that Nixon won based on the issues. But those who watched television and saw the two men, almost to a person, they agree that John F. Kennedy won. I don't know if that's a true story, but that is certainly a popular myth that's developed about those debates in the 1960 campaign. Now, what's really interesting is that Richard Nixon bounced back during the other 3 debates. He did a really good job and probably bested Kennedy in debates 2, 3, and 4. But no one remembers those. Really, most people formed their opinion about Richard Nixon based on the first 20 minutes of that initial debate in September of 1960. And that really is the power of image and television. Let's take a look here at a couple of Kennedy campaign brochures. So back before the internet, candidates could issue these paper brochures that would specifically address different issues that would matter to different voters. Kennedy made great use of this. He put out a whole slew of brochures. You can actually look at some of them on our website today at jfk.org, including these two. Notice the language in both of these, the one about the economy and the one about the environment. Who cares about your family's budget? Who cares about natural resources? And the answer is right there at the bottom. The Democrats care. Reinforcing this image that the Democrats are for the people. They understand, they empathize with regular folks. Notice here that Kennedy's name or his face doesn't appear on either of these on the cover of this brochure. It's not about him. It's about you. It's about the voter. And also, it's worth noting that the one on the left, who cares about natural resources, this is a very early example of environmentalism as a political issue. The environment, global warming, these are major campaign issues today that frequently get discussed by candidates. But Kennedy was one of the first to make this a political issue, as he did during the 1960 campaign. Let me zoom in for a minute at the bottom of these brochures so we can take a look at this message, the Democrats care. Those three pillars holding up the house there, we've got people, principle, and peace. Three easy P words to remember. And these are all words that Democrats would want voters to associate with their party when they were going to cast their ballot. In addition to targeting different groups and specific issues in these campaign brochures, Kennedy also created targeted campaign commercials aimed at specific groups. We're going to see an example of that right now with a commercial that was specifically targeted towards the African American community. Take a look at this.
Hi, my name is Harry Belafonte. I'm an artist, and I'm not a politician. But like most Americans, I have a great interest in the political and the economic destiny of my country. I'm seated here, Senator Jack Kennedy. As a Negro and as an American, I have many questions, and I'm sure everyone does, about civil rights, about foreign policy, about the economy of the country, and about things that'll happen.
And I want to make it very clear, Harry, that on this question of equality of opportunity for all Americans, whether it's in the field of civil rights, better minimum wages, better housing, better working conditions, jobs, I stand for these things. The Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt stood for them.
I'm voting for this, Senator. How about you?
Vote for a leader like Roosevelt. Vote for John F. Kennedy for president.
Okay, a very interesting commercial made specifically for the African American community. You know, African Americans had historically pledged their support to Republicans, the party of Abraham Lincoln. But by 1960, most were waiting to see how each candidate would address the issue of civil rights. We saw Nixon's specific commercial about civil rights, and it was a somewhat cold and detached message compared to this one. This is a very personal message that Kennedy put together, and he uses as a vehicle to get across his message a popular entertainer of the early 60s, a singer named Harry Belafonte, who is actually still alive today. He's 92 years old, but Harry Belafonte is still with us. What's interesting about that commercial, though, is that even though it was specifically targeted towards African Americans, it's not all about civil rights. It's a broader discussion than that. Certainly, civil rights was an issue of importance to African Americans, but it wasn't the exclusive issue. So in other words, in that commercial, Kennedy is treating them equally with white voters. He's being very inclusive, and people really paid attention to that. Kennedy also gained a key advantage with African Americans when he helped get Dr. Martin Luther King released from jail in Georgia. This became an issue during the campaign. Vice President Nixon would not go near it, did not want to become involved in it, but Kennedy stepped in and helped get King released. And that really solidified his support among the African American community. And African Americans have traditionally supported the Democratic Party really strongly since 1960. Before we move on to more commercials, I want to go back to brochures for just a moment. Here we have two more quick examples of Kennedy campaign brochures, and I like putting these side by side because they're directed at the young and the old. So we see Kennedy is specifically reaching out to senior citizens on the left, and on the right, he's talking directly to first-time voters. And notice that the brochure on the right about your first vote, that message at the bottom has changed a little bit. Now it's the Democrats care about tomorrow. Again, forward-thinking, appealing to youth, and again, that was very much part of what Kennedy was trying to get across with his campaign strategy. Also, notice that Kennedy appears on this brochure. It's the only one that we've looked at so far where his face appears. It is not by accident that it appears on a campaign brochure specifically aimed at young people. The Kennedy camp certainly knew that his attractiveness was of major appeal to young voters, particularly young women, so they were sure to put his face on that brochure for your first vote. Let's compare that to this Nixon brochure. This brochure is really about Nixon. It's very much a biographical brochure. It's not about the voters, and it's touting Nixon's experience over the past 8 years as vice president. There is a lot of text here, many, many words, and they touch on things like better housing, education, and civil rights. So he does address the issues of the day, but not in a way that really connects directly with the voters in a genuine and meaningful way. It's far more self-promotional than Kennedy's more empathetic brochures that are also just more modern in their design and message. The slogan, "Richard Nixon has the know-how," even now, 60 years after the 1960 election, Nixon, even then, Nixon just seems a little hokey or cheesy by comparison. Kennedy, his slogans still resonate today here in 2020, whereas Nixon just seems very old-fashioned by comparison. Now, Nixon had a big problem during that 1960 campaign, and that was his president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. You see, Nixon and Eisenhower, despite working together for the past 8 years, really didn't have a very good relationship. In fact, Eisenhower, when he was asked by the press to name just one of Nixon's accomplishments as vice president over 8 years, he had trouble thinking of a single example. And he didn't go out and campaign for Nixon until the very end of that campaign. And that was long after most people had made up their minds. And even on election day, when Dwight Eisenhower went to Gettysburg to cast his vote and the press asked him, "Who did you vote for, President Eisenhower?" He wouldn't tell them that he voted for Nixon. He wouldn't reveal who he cast his vote for, even though it was his vice president running for his party, the Republican Party, in that election. So not having the clear support and endorsement of such a beloved figure, a very popular president, that was very damaging to Nixon, and it really undermined all of his claims of leadership and experience when he couldn't even get his own president to really endorse that view of him. Something else that Nixon did that was a little odd was his choice of running mate. He chose United Nations Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge was from Massachusetts and didn't provide any strategic advantage at all to the ticket, because there was no way that Nixon was ever going to carry John F. Kennedy's home state of Massachusetts. So choosing a politician from Massachusetts was a bit of an odd choice. Unlike Kennedy, who very carefully made a strategic choice in naming Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. Lyndon Johnson was from Texas, and he was very influential throughout the South. And he made this nice contrast to Kennedy, who was seen as this New England politician that maybe didn't understand the South. He wasn't trusted by the Southerners. So Lyndon Johnson was there to shore up that support among the Democrats throughout the South. Now, Lyndon Johnson wasn't Kennedy's only secret weapon. He had several. One of his most powerful and influential weapons was his partner, Jackie Kennedy. Here is a TV commercial that aired in 1960 that specifically features Mrs. Kennedy. Take a look at this.
Queridos amigos, Les habla la esposa del senador John F. Kennedy, candidato a la presidencia de los Estados Unidos. En estos tiempos de tanto peligro, cuando la paz mundial se ve amenazada por el comunismo, es necesario tener en la Casa Blanca un líder capaz de guiar nuestros destinos con una mano firme. Mi esposo siempre vigilará los intereses de todos los sectores de nuestra sociedad que necesitan la protección de un gobierno humanitario para el futuro de nuestros niños y para lograr un mundo donde exista la paz verdadera. Voten ustedes por el Partido Demócrata el día 8 de noviembre. Que viva Kennedy.
All right, Viva Kennedy. There we see Mrs. Kennedy speaking Spanish. This was the first Spanish language presidential campaign commercial ever. Her concluding words there, Viva Kennedy, as you see in that button on the screen, was an important rallying cry in the Hispanic community during that 1960 election. Various cities established what were called Viva Kennedy clubs throughout the Southwest to register Mexican-American voters and build support for Kennedy. And this was the first time that Mexican Americans were really recognized as a significant voting bloc. They had really been ignored by the candidates prior to the 1960 election, but Kennedy tapped into that and secured their support and certainly carried the Hispanic community over Richard Nixon in that 1960 election. And that commercial showcased the grace and charm of Jacqueline Kennedy, who was poised to really be a new kind of First Lady. Here we see her juxtaposed with Richard Nixon's wife, Pat Nixon, who was Second Lady of the United States for the last 8 years with her husband, the Vice President. Pat Nixon was a wonderful woman. She was very popular among Republicans, but she was seen as a very traditional campaign wife. She stood silently behind her husband. She spoke only on occasion, and even then, she would typically only speak to women's groups and always about her husband's achievements exclusively, never about herself. Jackie Kennedy was something very different, bold and independent. Look at this magazine cover from August of 1959. Let me ask you guys another question. Why do you think the photographer took this picture of her in the way he did? What do you think? What do you make of this magazine cover?
Any ideas? Birchwood, Dexter? Looks like Dexter has an answer. Dexter, go ahead. All right, Dexter, try again. We can't hear you. All right, we can't hear Dexter, but it does, we do have an answer in the chat from Corpus Christi that says to show support for women's rights.
That's a really interesting interpretation of that cover. It certainly is putting women at the forefront, and really for the first time, a candidate's wife appears in front of her husband. A very deliberate choice, having Kennedy, the man actually running for president, kind of out of focus there in the background and making Mrs. Kennedy the prominent part of that cover. The headline reads, Jackie Kennedy, a front-runner's appealing wife. But certainly it was pointing to again, this forward-thinking notion. She was going to be a new kind of first lady. She was independent. She was strong. You would never have seen a Life magazine with Pat Nixon on the cover, with Richard Nixon kind of blurry in the background. This is something that Jackie Kennedy, through her grace and charm, was able to achieve. So that's an interesting way of interpreting that cover as kind of a push for women's rights. I like that. One other secret weapon, really arguably the most important secret weapon that John F. Kennedy had in his arsenal during that 1960 campaign, was his World War II heroism. He had been a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy during World War II. But at the same time, so had Richard Nixon. But unfortunately for Nixon, his service was primarily on the administrative and clerical side, preparing things like shipping manifests and flight plans. His service to his country during a time of war, of course, was admirable, but it wasn't particularly memorable. Unlike John F. Kennedy, who became the stuff of World War II legend as the commander of this small patrol boat, PT-109 in the South Pacific, Kennedy had a harrowing adventure that would change his life and also help to forge his political identity. On August 2nd, 1943, PT-109 was struck by this Japanese freighter, the Amagiri, and Kennedy's boat was cut in half. 2 crew members were killed instantly. Kennedy and the other survivors had to swim over 3 miles to a nearby island where they were rescued a week later. And very quickly, it became this instant story of heroism in the face of death and destruction. Take a look at this front page from the Boston Evening Globe, August 19th, 1943, just a few days after the crew was rescued off that island. And you see almost comic book style. We see almost like they're superheroes. We see these comic panels tracing their harrowing adventure after the sinking of PT-109. It really became this story of legend, which Kennedy used to great advantage in his political career, going all the way back to his first congressional campaign in 1946 and extending to his Senate campaigns later on. Booklets like these shared that breathless and dramatic story of PT-109 from the perspective of Lieutenant Jack Kennedy, and these were printed and distributed all over Massachusetts. There was this national push during the 1960 presidential election to make sure voters everywhere knew the story of PT-109 and could appreciate the courage and heroism of John F. Kennedy. So much so that the Kennedy campaign went to the extraordinary lengths of creating this extra long campaign commercial, almost like a little mini movie that they aired on TV during the 1960 campaign, hosted by a Hollywood celebrity, a famous actor named Henry Fonda. Let's take a look at that commercial, or at least part of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Henry Fonda.
I've always been an admirer of Franklin D. Roosevelt. So I was especially interested recently when I saw a movie of FDR as a young man, his fight against polio, his courage, his endurance, his will to live. It was an experience that history says had a deep influence on the leadership he gave our country as president. At a time when our country was hurt and stricken, when we all needed courage and endurance. I know another man like that with the same strong character, the indomitable will to live. This I've known for over 15 years, ever since I read an article in the Reader's Digest by John Hersey about a young naval officer in the Solomon Islands during some of the darkest days and nights of World War II. August 2nd, 1943, in the South Pacific. A U.S. Navy PT boat is patrolling the Solomons. The Japanese fleet is everywhere. 3 miles to the northeast, 10,000 Japanese are on Kolombangara Island. 5 miles to the west is Vela La Vela, more Japanese. 1 mile south, the Japanese camp on Gizo. The PT boat is cruising quietly. At the wheel is her captain, Navy Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. Suddenly, out of the dark night, a Japanese destroyer bears down at 40 knots and rams the PT boat in two. Thrown on his back on the deck, Lieutenant Kennedy stares up to see the destroyer pass through his boat. But half the PT boat stays afloat, and Lieutenant Kennedy helps 10 other survivors hang on. Eventually, they leave the sinking hulk and swim for a small island 3 miles southwest. One man has been badly injured. Lieutenant Kennedy ties a strap to the man's life jacket and tows him with his teeth the entire distance. It takes 5 hours to swim it. Lost for 9 days in enemy territory, Lieutenant Kennedy painfully, slowly swims from island to island, reef to reef, scouting for help, watching the seas and straits for other PT boats. He drifts, floats, sleeps while being carried by the current. For days, he swims back to lead them to another island, swimming, drifting, treading over sharp coral, once more towing the injured man with his teeth. On the 9th day, it ends. An SOS Lieutenant Kennedy had carved on a coconut shell and given to a native, got past the Japanese and reached the Allies. And finally, one of the PT boats Lieutenant Kennedy had been searching for picks them up. "Hey, Jack," someone calls from the boat. "Where have you been?" asks Kennedy. "We've got some food for you." "No thanks," says Kennedy. "I just had a coconut."
All right, we're going to go ahead and move on. That commercial lasts a couple more minutes, actually. It's an epic length, and it's like a little miniature war movie. You expect John Wayne or someone to come out at any moment, really emphasizing that Kennedy was this figure of courage and heroism. And you see, this was what he used to combat Richard Nixon's experience and leadership that we saw earlier in the program. Nixon may have had 8 years as vice president, but Kennedy is a true Navy hero who saved men's lives and acted admirably under tremendous strain and pressure. And so that was something that they really sought to emphasize. Every survivor of PT 109 came out and got on the campaign trail with Kennedy in 1960. And they produced all of this campaign stuff that used the ship, PT 109, just as shorthand for Kennedy's courage and leadership. And so you see a charm bracelet there at the bottom for women, and then there was a tie clip produced for men with Kennedy 60 written on the bow of the ship. Just really remarkable pieces of campaign memorabilia that don't really speak to any of the major issues of the 60 campaign, but they are emphasizing this dramatic story of Kennedy's heroism. And so in the end, John F. Kennedy did win the election, and he took over from Dwight Eisenhower, becoming the 35th president of the United States on January 20th, 1961. But looking back, even though it appears that Kennedy did everything right in creating this exciting and new modern presidential campaign, and Richard Nixon made a lot of mistakes relying upon a traditional old-fashioned formula, it was still an extremely close election. Take a look at this map here. Kennedy received 49.7% of the popular vote, and Nixon received 49.6% of the popular vote. That's a national difference of less than 120,000 votes. And notice the colors. Of course, red, just like today, red is Republican, blue is Democrat. A few differences than we see on the electoral map of 2020. California went Republican. That was Richard Nixon's home state, but especially the South. Look at how from New Mexico all the way over to North Carolina, the whole South is basically blue in this election, except for that other color, which you see was electoral votes cast in protest for Virginia Senator Harry Byrd. So all of Mississippi, half of Alabama, and one elector in Oklahoma decided to cast their protest ballot for Harry Byrd. He opposed the civil rights movement, and these Democrats who cast these protest votes were not pleased with Kennedy's very progressive look at civil rights in the country, so they decided to cast their vote for a segregationist. And so America did take a chance on John F. Kennedy, and there was this transition historically from the oldest president up to that time to the youngest man ever elected president. But unfortunately, just after less than 3 years in the White House, Kennedy was assassinated, just as he was gearing up for re-election in 1964. Much of what he set out to do, including the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, was carried out by his successor, Lyndon Johnson, as a memorial tribute to President Kennedy. And that really brings us full circle back to the importance of the 1960 campaign, particularly its political legacy. Because John F. Kennedy may have been assassinated, but in many ways he's still been running for president practically every election cycle since 1960. He is forever this youthful figure who fulfills America's hope and promise. And Democrats, ever since 1960, have been trying to harness his image, harness his charisma and rhetoric. And we see it here. On the left is a button that Lyndon Johnson used when he was running for president in 1964. Let us continue. You see that kind of transparent image of Kennedy on the right-hand side. Let us continue reflects on one of Kennedy's messages during his inaugural address in 1961. Let us begin. We need to continue that tradition, and John F. Kennedy's natural heir is Lyndon Johnson. And on the right, when Kennedy's younger brother Robert Kennedy ran for president in 1968, we see America calls another Kennedy. Unfortunately, Robert Kennedy, too, was assassinated in 1968. But in this campaign button, we see the reflection, almost the shadow of his brother right beside him as he ran for president. Other Democrats have placed Kennedy alongside past presidents in this pantheon of Democratic leaders, emphasizing Democratic integrity, the great Democratic tradition. You might have noticed, if you were listening carefully, that in practically all of those television commercials we looked at today, there was mention of Franklin Roosevelt. Kennedy himself was trying to tie himself to the legacy of very popular Democratic President Franklin Roosevelt. And here, in modern times, here in the 1988 campaign and in 1992 with Bill Clinton, we see Kennedy alongside Roosevelt, this showcase, this hall of presidents of leaders of the past, and these men running for president wanting to be part of that great Democratic tradition. And then candidates in very recent times have tried to create direct comparisons to President Kennedy. So in 2004, on the left, Massachusetts Senator John F. Kerry, another JFK from Massachusetts, he took Kennedy's quote from his inaugural address about the torch has been passed to a new generation and uses that here. The torch is passed for a new JFK to Kerry. So again, John F. Kerry trying to take the mantle from John F. Kennedy, both Massachusetts senators, and seen as this heir apparent. And then in 2008, the soaring and often inspirational rhetoric of Barack Obama was often compared directly to Kennedy. And we see that reflected here in this button, I am asking you to believe. So there are still these echoes of 1960 today. When we think about the use of social media, it reflects on television, how television was such an influential source of image and instant perception. Social media, Twitter has taken over that today, instantly telling us what a candidate is thinking, what they're wearing, how they look, where they are. I mean, all of that is important in shaping their overall image for voters, and doing so in an instantaneous way, the way that in 1960 television was able to do it. And also, 1960, as this modern campaign, was really one of the first in which how a candidate looked and sounded, particularly on television, really mattered and really influenced the way people viewed them. If you think back to the past before we had television, Abraham Lincoln, other great American figures of the past, image wasn't quite as important. But with television, it certainly was, and John F. Kennedy was a master of it and won that 1960 election. So I'd like to take this opportunity. I think we have about maybe 7 to 10 minutes left. If there are any questions about what we've talked about today or about the 6th floor museum here at Dealey Plaza.
All right, any questions? You can either come up and ask, or you can use the chat box. Looks like South Creek has a question. South Creek, go ahead.
When John F. Kennedy's boat went down, which island did he go to?
Oh, that's a great question. What island did he swim to? He swam to an island in the Solomons. It was part of the Solomon Islands, and the specific island that they swam to was actually called Plum Pudding Island. That's a wonderful, if obscure, question, but it makes me look really smart. So thank you very much for asking that.
All right, any other questions? Birchwood, South Creek. Well, here's one in the chat box. How did JFK's Catholicism influence his voters' vote?
That's a great question, and if this was a double-linked program, I would have certainly got into the Catholic issue, because that was a major campaign issue in 1960. President Kennedy was going to be and did become the first Catholic president. And so his opponents seized on that. There was still a great deal of prejudice in the United States against Catholics, and there was this widespread belief among his political adversaries that, well, he's Catholic, that means that the Pope in Rome will be controlling the White House, will be influencing American policy. And that was something that Kennedy adamantly denied. He said that that would never happen. And Kennedy went about combating that in a very strategic way, like he did so much else. He made arrangements to speak to the Houston Ministerial Alliance here in Texas, and he basically did a 30-minute address before a group of ministers in Houston. Now, it was televised. Kennedy's address is not really directed at the ministers in that auditorium. They knew how they felt going in. They knew that he knew that they were prejudiced against his Catholicism. But what he did was he used that as a prepackaged 30-minute television vehicle to reach voters across the country to explain how he was a Democrat first and a Catholic second. He was basically saying that he would never put his faith and let his faith influence how he behaved in the White House. And it really became a non-issue after that broadcast from Houston. So he tackled that very strategically, like he did so much else in that campaign.
Awesome. It looks like South Creek has some questions. Go ahead, South Creek.
Did Kennedy have any kids, and does he have any relatives today?
Yeah, the president had 2 children. He had Caroline, and during that 1960 campaign, Jackie Kennedy was pregnant with his son, John F. Kennedy Jr. Caroline Kennedy is still alive today. John F. Kennedy Jr. very sadly died in a plane crash in 1999. Jackie Kennedy died of cancer in the mid-90s, about 1994, I believe. The president's brothers have all passed away. I believe there's one sister remaining. I believe it was a very large family, the Kennedys, and I believe there's one sister remaining today. And of course, a lot of nieces and nephews. In fact, there's a politician today, I believe, Joe Kennedy III, that is sometimes in the news, and he is related to President Kennedy. President Kennedy, I think, was his great uncle, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, the Kennedys are still a major force in American politics today. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead and ask your question.
My question is, how many siblings did JFK have?
I want to say 6 or 7. We're looking that up over here on the master computer to tell you in just a second. The Kennedy family is not really an area of expertise for me, but we'll figure it out. I do believe it was 6 or 7 siblings. I can tell you about his brothers. His elder brother, Joe, died during World War II. Then Kennedy was the second oldest boy, followed by Robert Kennedy, who was killed in 1968 while running for president. And then the youngest brother, Ted, became the famous senator from Massachusetts, Senator Ted Kennedy, who died, I believe, in 2009 is when he passed away. I'm sorry? 8. He had 8 siblings, so there was 8 total. Total. 8 children total. No, so
8 siblings. Sorry.
8 siblings. Sorry. Kennedy had 8 siblings. I told you about the boys, and the rest were all girls. So thank you for that question.
All right. Any last questions in the chat or from South Creek? All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We do have sessions going into March, so please check us out for those. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Stephen. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right. Have a great day. Bye, everybody.
Bye.